This is Video History from the J. Bay Jacobs Library for the History of Obstetrics and Gynecology in America. It's a pleasant spring day in 1996 in Denver, Colorado. My guest today is Mrs. Elaine Locke, a longtime staff member of the college. It would be all right if I call you Elaine as
Please
we go
do.
through the interview. Let's begin, since I described you as a longtime staff member, by saying, when did you come to the college? It's 1996 now.
Well, I came on April 1st, 1970, April Fool's Day, and I guess that means the joke is on me.
So it's been 26 years,
Right.
26 years and a few days. Now, what was your first job with the college?
I believe the title was legislative assistant. There had not been an internal legislative program per se, nor anybody working specifically in that area. I'd had experience in that before, so I was hired to start the government relations department.
And who was the person to whom you were responsible? Who'd you work for?
I was reporting to Mrs. Thelma Hayes, and she was in turn reporting to Dr. Irvin Nichols, who was the Associate Director Medical
Right.
within the college.
Yes, at that time there was a director who was Donald Richardson, and then a physician director, I think only one, correct?
Dr. Michael Newton was the executive
that's right.
director at
Yes,
that
at that time.
time, and there was an associate director business, associate director medical.
So you were the first legislative person, and
That's correct.
now there's a government relations department staff of 8
Probably
or 10
8 or
some-
10.
8 or
Since
10
I'm
or
not on
something-
it, I'm not too
something
well aware.
like that. Well, certainly for us, and I hope for you, it's been a good 26 years. But
Indeed it has.
let me start by asking you where you were born.
I was born in Bemidji, Minnesota, which is about 240 miles north of Minneapolis.
The home of the great blue ox, as I remember.
That's where
Yes.
he is.
Yes, a large statue.
Yes.
And where'd you go to school?
I went to the University of Chicago and took a degree in English literature with the intention to teach high school, which I did for a year. And
Where'd you teach?
at Lyons Township High School in LaGrange, Illinois. And subsequently, a number of years later, after beginning work at the college, I went for a master's in public administration at Roosevelt University in Chicago.
Did you come from school teaching to the college?
No, I, as a matter of fact, went to Steel Company in Cicero, Illinois for 5 months, which was an interesting experience, and then began work in a trade association, Boating Industry Association in Chicago, in the Department of Government Relations, and found I was fascinated with the process and learned a lot.
How did you end up starting with the college?
I read an
saw
ad in the
paper.
newspaper, and it was women's health, and I had always been interested in health. What could be better than women's health, and getting a chance to start a legislative department all for myself?
Well, tell me then, and let's spend our time talking about the years that you've spent with the college, and because it's certainly been good for the college, and I hope good years for you. From starting out as the legislative analyst, what happened?
Well, I guess the first thing that happened, you will recall yourself that there was a committee on government relations at the time I was hired, and it was chaired by Dr. Warren Pearse, who was in Omaha at the time.
It's hard for even me to remember back that far.
And there was to be a meeting, one meeting a year, I guess, was the norm, in February of 1971, the following year. And you decided that since so many of the activities were now being done on a staff basis, that there was no need for a committee. So I met once with the committee as you officiated at its demise. But the interesting thing is I have the budget for that year for the Government Relations Committee, which was basically the activity aside from my salary, and it was for $4,000, but we didn't spend it.
We did. As I remember, our government relations was mainly confined to me taking the plane to Washington and visiting various people and seeing what went on.
There was a lot of that. There was a lot of reading of the congressional record, including one that went out under a staff memo to selected staff in 1973, indicating that Congress was looking at the issue of conditioning capitation to medical schools for medical students on a willingness to channel most of them into primary care.
Sure. Nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new. And by 1976, we were able to report that even if there were some that were unconvinced in this area, there weren't very many people left around Washington in the medical societies that were unaware that OBGYNs were willing to take on this responsibility.
Where did you move on then next in terms of your responsibilities with the college?
This was a slow, gradual sort of thing as the college's activities and government expanded, and when you came to the college as the executive director in the summer of 1975, I believe it was within 2 or 3 weeks that you asked me to set up a staff study committee to look at the issue yet again of moving to Washington. It wasn't a new idea. That was moving a legislative department to Washington only at that time, or at least that was the way the report came out in January of 1976.
There were many universities as sort of a model that had offices in Washington, and societies increasingly were, and to us it seemed like a good idea too. Mm-hmm. What next?
Well, I actually moved in November of 1976, and I believe you picked up a lease on an apartment for me that you described in unfavorable terms, but it was a temporary sort of thing. It was a good location on the hill, and in essence, it became the college's first office for the next 2 or 3 months with some office equipment in my studio apartment, and I still occasionally get calls or bills from the Washington phone company because the original phone number was my apartment number, and somehow the computers have kept it alive. So it was the time of a changing administration in Washington. I knew I was moving in November. A lot of people didn't. And then the office itself actually opened on North Capitol in early February of 1977.
How large was the staff there?
I believe there were 4 of us when we were fully staffed. Dr. Irvin Nichols, the director of practice activities by that time, was still the person that I reported to, and he was initially in Chicago.
And not too long after that, as I recall, he moved to Washington.
That's correct. In June, I moved back to Chicago as my choice, and he was willing to move here, and I think that accelerated our progress, too. I do have one relic from those times. We decided that one way of getting the college known around Washington and in congressional offices was to have a file folder that when we sent a bit of testimony or a letter supporting something to a congressman or somebody in what was at that time health, education, and welfare, they would have an ACOG folder to slip it into. So our purposes and so forth were described on the front, our address and all of that.
Where were we located then in Washington?
Well, the interesting thing is that the folder says we were at 400 North Capitol, which is what the post office told us the address would be. It was later changed to 444. This was a new building which had been fought over by the Senate as to whether they would use it. Instead, we were the first tenants to come in and assign space finishing details. So that was a new experience, being architects, whatever.
It was a small office, as I recall.
Very small office. But we did start to have a lot of ACOG meetings in Washington when that was more favorable for weather or transportation.
Now you were back in Chicago, and
yes.
What were your responsibilities then?
The first year I still had major responsibilities in the Washington office because a replacement had not been hired for me, so I did a lot of migrating to and fro. At that time, I also took on responsibility for a number of very active new projects. That was the era of government-authorized or enforced health planning. But probably the one that was most important and has had the longest and most vigorous life was the Task Force on Adolescent Pregnancy, which began in 1977 and was very active with government contracts and so forth for 3 years. Other activities bridged a gap. Then a committee was revitalized and is today the Committee on Adolescent Health Care.
What college fellows were you working with during these years that you particularly remember?
it's hard to single people out, really, and I'd have to say that people I might name have to stand for a lot of other people. But certainly Dr. Irvin Nichols, as my boss for 15 years, was not only a boss, but was an inspiration, and really he had an insistence on excellence, whether it was in medicine or in running an association, and there was an esprit de corps that was wonderful. So he was a real personal and professional inspiration to me. Also in those early years, and I think more on a college-wide basis as far as college programs, Dr. John McCain from Atlanta was involved with many of the things that I was. His vision for the fact there had to be professional peer review as well as representation in Washington were among the features there.
John McCain was ahead of his time in many ways.
He really was.
He was a loss when he went.
He was. The other person that has been a personal influence and has shown me many things in leadership, chaired the task force on adolescent pregnancy, Dr. Ezra Davidson. I've worked with him extensively over the years. And if you take the leadership capabilities of those people and look at how much they've had to do with the college, I think it's remarkable.
As you moved on into the 80s, I know you were still involved, of course, with the adolescent pregnancy. What other things? It seems some days to me that you've been responsible for everything. But,
well, there was a shift early on. Things that related to public health or to government regulation in any way kind of stuck to me. And one of the earliest of those that I still have is the Committee on Ethics. I believe the college was the first specialty society to have anything in the ethics area. And the committee began in 1974, growing out of questions about fetal experimentation, as it was often referred to at the time. Also, that was just after the legalization of abortion. So those two factors pushed, even though many of the topics that the committee has taken up and takes up today, such as the most recent one of physician responsibility in managed care or a changing healthcare environment, have not been focused on the direct reproductive bioethical issues.
in 1981, the college moved in its entirety from Chicago to Washington. Did you debate about moving with it or not?
Not very long. I think I applied for one job, which I believe was offered to me, and it had some opportunities, but it didn't seem to have the interest or the capability of really working with the professionals that it would be the association for in the way that I had done with the college. And I just felt that the job satisfaction would not be there.
Well, you've certainly identified the things that most of us know you for as the committees relating to adolescents and underserved women, ethics. What other things have you been involved with? Because I know you have.
The shifts that came with our move to Washington included some that other staff members had done, but that I had had an interest in, the chief of which were our Native American programs. We had had a committee on American Indian Affairs, or predecessor groups, going back to 1970. So in 1981, I took over those activities, which involved contract activities for placement of our fellows in vacancies, as well as committee site visits and postgraduate courses.
It's a very important program, not only for the fellows, but certainly for the American Indians over the years.
We hear that it's been helpful. In 81, I also then took over all of the peer review quality assurance activities. So that included the era of the beginning of the voluntary review of quality of care program. And then I guess the most recent formal addition to my activities were those under international in about 1985. So that it's been said I have the only affairs in the college, with American Indian Affairs, international affairs, but we don't call it ethics affairs.
Dr. Nichols, along about mid-'80s, retired, and then you worked for?
Dr. Harold Kamenetsky took that position in practice activities and was there for about another 8 years, and then Dr. Stanley Zinberg. In the meantime, because the organization, as I say, things tended to stick to me, I had some other directors along the way. When Dr. John Graham came to the college, he took over the Ethics Committee and the Quality Assurance activities and supervised me directly on those. When Dr. Kamenetsky came, because of his interest in international, that became a shared activity between you and him. And so when I acquired some of that role, I had 2 directors for that one, and Dr. Hale continues to be my director for international activities. But I really have the home in the Department of the Division of Practice Activities, with the title now as Associate Director for Practice Liaison. Liaison being a very wide-ranging thing, obviously all these committees, but also many little independent activities.
I think it's fair to say that many things you started out as being the sole person responsible for now have a whole department someplace in the college that are dealing with them.
Well, that's true. The liaison thing is an example. At one time, I knew all about the AMA House of Delegates and American Public Health Association and so forth. I must have worked faster in those days because now so many things have split off, and while I'm doing a great deal of liaison, I guess it's with more intimate, individual, ever-burgeoning groups.
Any people in the more modern years that you particularly have identified among the fellows in working with?
Well, I think one of the delightful things has been the growth of the number of women in leadership in the college, although Dr. Luella Klein and I have never been able to figure out when we first met. She's not one of the recent additions to this repertoire of women that are coming into exciting leadership, but there are many of them, and I'm waiting for more.
As we all are. What's your main focus today with the college?
Well, it is liaison, and this often is liaison for ad hoc purposes for short periods of time, often with coalitions of professional groups, but government agencies as well, because even though I'm not in government relations now, once it gets past the stage of influencing legislation or regulation, we never quite quit talking to government about those things. So I've attended many meetings of national advisory boards and NIH, National Cancer Advisory Board. But in addition to attendance, a major focus is to find fellows of the college that are particularly suited to represent the college in places where more needs to be done than I can do as a non-medical person. Needs somebody that can really talk with expertise about the issue that is on the table.
Elaine, I'd like to personally thank you, not only for being here today, but obviously for all of the things that you've done for the college over the years. It's been great for us because you've led many things into the modern era, and all of the fellows should be as grateful to you as the staff of the college is.
Thank you.